Hello, my name is David Rocco. I'm a co-founder of the organization Friends of the Mount Beacon 8. As regards to two plane crashes took place at Mount Beacon, both Navy plane crashes. The first one took place on September 14, 1935. The two pilots were killed. 10 years later, a mile away from that crash site, on November 11, 1945, 6 men were killed. So a group of us got together to honor those 8 men, and that's how they're called the Mount Beacon 8. One of these 6 in 1945 turns out to be a Navy legend by the name of Dixie Kiefer. It's hard to ignore his 30-year career because he did a lot of incredible feats along the way. He served in both World Wars. He graduated from Annapolis in an accelerated program. It was supposed to be the class in 1919, but they graduated him in 1918 so he could get over to Europe and fight. Then, of course, he was in World War II. I'll get some more details about that later. Let's start the slideshow. There's Dixie in these dress blues, I guess they call him. He was, I'll get to it later, but at the time of his death, he was Commodore Dixie Kiefer. It was a title, a promotion that he had received a few months earlier to acknowledge his achievements and also include a pay raise. It was a ceremony that was held in Rockefeller Center in New York City. It was hosted by Beacon native James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of the Navy at the time. After Forrestal read off the Dixie Kiefer's achievements between World War I and World War II, he turned around and said to him, "You are the indestructible man." Next. Okay, now the Mount Beacon 8 made up, as I mentioned, the two plane crashes. The one in 1935 occurred it's called the Scofield Bridge. That's probably for people in the area. It's a little bit north of the Beacon Reservoir, along the ledge or the ridge overlooking Route 9 and the former Duchess Mall. The pilot was Lincoln Denton, and the co-pilot was, actually was a machinist mate, Clinton Hart. Denton was 27, as you can see, and Hart was 28. Hart was actually born in Westchester County, Katona, before he moved to the city, and he was married. Denton wasn't. Next. Okay, a couple years ago, I went up to the Rhinebeck Aerodrome Air Show, and they had a lineup of these old planes along the pedestrian path. And the sign to the left of the front of the plane had the year of that model, which was 1929 to 1941. So I asked the owner of the plane, would a 1935 model be similar to what I'm looking at this moment? He said, absolutely, with some minor changes, this is what it was. So it was a surreal moment for me because I got to see a plane from 1935 and dealing with, the crashes that took the lives of Denton and Hart. Next. Now, Denton and Hart were stationed in Floyd Bennett Field, which is in Brooklyn. It's right on Jamaica Bay. They were taking a routine flight up to Albany, to Detroit, back to Albany, and their final leg was from Albany to New York. They actually flew over the city of Beacon, the town of Fishkill, and, well, that's right, and were over the city of Peekskill. They were in tandem with another plane, but for whatever reason, Denton made a right turn, one west and north of the Hudson River, over the mountain where the client, and the dance hall was the casino. And the dancers there that night heard the plane sputtering, and then they heard the sound of a muffled explosion. Next. This was the copy of the newspaper the very next day. It was very difficult to find the crash site. So the authorities reached out to the state with the CCC camp down in what we know now as Fort State Park. All these young men came up. In case you don't know what CCC means, it's Conservation Corps, Civilian Conservation Corps. And they came up and they actually were the first to find it. You can see the logo on the top left, U.S. Navy. The sad thing about this photo is the bodies of both Denton and Hart are still in the wreckage. Next. Denton is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, as well as Hart and two of the men from the 1945 crash, which is going to be the pilot on Kohler. No, that's Lloyd Heinsohn, and of course Dixie Kiefer. Next. That's Clinton Hart's headstone. The sad thing is, like a lot of these national cemeteries, the trees are starting to engulf the headstones, and it's a major problem across the country. I visit a national cemetery on a regular basis in San Diego when I'm out west, and it's a balance between saving the trees and what to do with the headstones. So I saw that throughout Arlington. Next. I checked this helicopter shot. I'm looking south over, I guess you want to say, the Fishkill Ridge section of Mount Beacon. You can see in the background, the little blue dot that's speck. That's the Beacon Reservoir. And I think to your left, down below, is Lake Valhalla. To the far right, you see the Hudson River, just to see what the terrain was. Next. Now, believe it or not, there's still some pieces of the plane from 1935. I did a PowerPoint presentation probably 5 years ago already at the Beacon Historical Society. And I had just seen these parts about a day or two earlier, and I was able to share these photographs. But that night, there was another surprise that I'll get to you later about. Next. Now, these are a couple of the guys that are part of the Friends of the Mount Beacon 8. It's not an official organization per se, like 501c3. It's ad hoc, ADHOC. That's when you get people together to do a goal, and then everybody goes in different directions when the goal is accomplished. This is the crash site for the 1935. The ruins are behind us to the left. So in both crash sites, we put the American flag, New York State flag, and the Navy flag, and the inscription up on top of the historic marker, which is both sides, will detail who was killed there, what happened there, where they were going. Next. That's when I first got them. The historical marker signs, I put them up with the American flag behind them. So now you can basically see for yourself. 1935 crash says Navy reservist Denton and Hart flying in the Curtis SBC hell diver lost their lives at this location known as Scofield Bridge when their plane crashed on their return trip from Albany, New York to Floyd Bennett Field Naval Air Station in Brooklyn. And it's a little bit easier to read the larger one. The 6 Navy veterans lost their lives at this location flying on their return trip from Curtis Wright Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey to Quonset Point Naval Air Station in North Kingston, Rhode Island. Kiefer and Zaleski both served in World War I and World War II. Next. So this is the historic marker when we installed it at the 1945 crash site. The gentleman to the far right was the co-founder of the organization for me, Dr. Bill Stelfy. The gentleman to my left is James Burns, who's a Beacon resident. James and I became friends, co-volunteers on the restoration project of the Mount Beacon Fire Tower. and to Dr. Stoffi's right is John. John served in the Marines and Bill served in the Navy. Next. So this is the list of the 6 men that were killed on November 11, 1945. Keep in mind that wasn't Veterans Day at that time, it was Armistice Day. It became Veterans Day 1954. So there's Commodore Dixie Kiefer, who's from Blackfoot, Idaho, who was only 49 at the time. Pilot Lieutenant Lloyd Heinsohn, he was from Colorado Springs. He was just 27 years old, but he also had the title of Navy Ace. He had shot down 5 Japanese airplanes in gun battles in the South Pacific. He himself was shot down, but survived, obviously. Co-pilot was Hans Kohler, who was from Garfield, New Jersey. At the time of his death, he was born and raised in Germany. Exactly, I'm going to say raised. He came up here when he was 3 years old. He actually was a gunner when he joined the Navy right out of high school in 1938, but he wanted to become a pilot, which he did, and became an award-winning pilot. He was supposed to get his award several weeks after the return flight, which never happened, of course. Then you have Dr. Ignacio Zaleski, who served in World War I. He was actually the county coroner for Essex County, which is where Salem, Massachusetts is located. When he was in World War I, he was in the Army. He was just 44. Machinist mate Clarence Hooper from Greensboro, North Carolina. He's an African American, which I found surprising at the time, considering that the military was not segregated until 1948. He was just 22. And then Seaman First Class David Wood was 23. He had only been in the Navy about a year. Next. And the thing that got me about during my research was that Dixie Kiefer always got all the headlines. And then the more I got into it, I understood why. I just wanted to bring recognition to the other 5 men, because when the research started, we only knew about the first crash in 1945. But then Bob Murphy, the late Bob Murphy from the Beacon Historical Society, really got into this as well. So he had discovered that there had been a Navy plane crash in 1935. So from Friends of the Mount Beacon 6, they went to the Friends of the Mount Beacon 8. So just want to make sure these other 7 men were not forgotten about. Next. That's a sample of the plane that Dixie Kiefer was on. It's a typical short flight type airplane, Beechcraft Model 18 JRB4. That's basically what they used statewide during the war. Thank you. Next. Now, Quonset Point, it's in Rhode Island. It was a big naval air station, actually also accommodated aircraft carriers and ships of small sizes. I think the base closed down in 1974 during some budget cuts. Dixie Kiefer became the commanding officer at that base, I think, May of 1945, after he recovered from his injuries that he sustained on the USS Ticonderoga. He was the commanding officer of the Ticonderoga, actually the first one, where he was injured during 2 kamikaze attacks, January of that year. I'll get to more details later about that. Next. That's the typical air traffic control tower for airports at that time. Quonset Airport is now the Rhode Island National Air Guard base. The rest of the facility that was formerly the Naval Air Station has been subdivided into industrial sites. It's a major employer now. So it went from an abandoned facilities to a major employer, and I guess tax revenue for that area. Next. Now, as I mentioned before, when they left Rhode Island, they came down on Saturday, um, November 10th. They landed at Essex County Airport. Most likely, at that time, it was called Curtis Wright Airport. Most likely for the reason is that Dick Kiefer worked there as an inspector for the Navy. Because the next town over was Paterson, New Jersey, and that was the Curtis Wright factory, the airplane factory. So when Dixie Kiefer wasn't on the ship, he was one of the Navy's leading inspectors because he had a degree in mechanical engineering. He actually had a master's at MIT as well. He came down Saturday the 10th just to go see a football game at Yankee Stadium, which was between Army and Notre Dame. At that time, Army was a powerhouse in college football. I think 3 years in a row, they had the best player in college, which received the Heisman Trophy. I guess they agreed to meet Sunday morning so they could head back to Rhode Island. Next. There's a picture of the renovated old original Yankee Stadium photograph I took. So just give you an idea before they knocked it down. Seats in the top left-hand corner, that's the new stadium that's under construction. The old stadium is now City Ball Field. Next. There's an actual photograph of the game between Army and Notre Dame. Keep in mind, as you know, it's the traditional Army-Navy game that is usually around the first weekend of December. So everybody, I guess, was getting pumped up because the war was over. The United States won 2 wars on 2 different fronts, the European theater back in the spring, and then in August in Japan. So I guess everybody was just glad to be home and start enjoying themselves. Next. Just a bird's eye view photograph I took from Manhattan just to give people maybe an idea what it looks like and just to wonder what those guys did that night. The only thing I came across is that Dixie Kiefer had a dinner engagement with one of the Pratt Whitney aviation executives. I don't know what the other 5 guys did that day, but I know they did meet during the 11th hour the next morning, Sunday, November 11th. Next. Back to the former Curtis Wright Airport, which is now Essex County Airport. They met during the 11th hour on the 11th day in the 11th month. And amazingly, thanks to the cell phones and the apps that we have now, I was able to determine that the plane crash in 1945 happened 1,100 feet up on Mount Beacon. Amazing. Next. That's a view from Stewart Airport, both peaks of Mount Beacon. The plane crash occurred on the far left side of the photograph where the trees are. You'll see one of the photographs later how close they missed another ridge, which is probably in the area on Route 52, near where the old Dunkin' Donuts used to be, and the laundromat and the bar and the gas station, and the car wash. So if you look straight in that area, when the leaves are down, sometimes you'll be able to see the flags that are flying up on the crash site. Next. That's a view that I took a photograph. And you can see the trail that kind of starts on a little bit on your left, comes up around the bend, and then makes it right. And that's where the crash site is. Over the top of the ridge is, like I said, looking east is where Route 9 is. And the plane crash 35 is to the top right. They're about a mile from each other. The trail was cleared by sailors and Marines in 1945 when they came down from Quonset Point, Rhode Island. The authorities could not find the plane crash, or they took two local Fishkill residents who used to work at the former Texaco plant. When they got off their midnight shift, they both ran up to the top following the crash site. We're trying to find the crash site. And once they started to hear explosions and sounds of like gunfire, that had to do with, I guess, they fire and to carry guns. Maybe Dixie Keeper had a pistol, so that was making all the noise. And the plane area site was still on fire. So he agreed one guy would stay behind and the other would go down and get the authorities. So the word got back up to the base in Rhode Island, and they sent as many 200 men down to create a trail so they can get the bodies down. And keep in mind, in 1945, there was no interstate highway system yet. So to go from, Quantico Point, Rhode Island to Fishkill took a while. Next. These are the remains of the plane crash from 1945. The gentleman to the left is the ranger from the Mount Beacon Fire. That's how his last name is Bell. And Bell was a big family name in Beacon area. And turns out that he took one of the propellers from that plane crash. You'll see shortly. Next. There's Dixie Keeper's cap at the bottom of the photo here. You can see to the right, U.S. Navy. The plane was, when it flew over Stewart, was given clearance to head towards Hartford, Connecticut on its way to Rhode Island. The plane should have been 3,000 feet up, but they encountered heavy rain and fog, so they stayed a little bit lower than the level of the clouds. And from what I was told, that's called scud flying. Unfortunately, the mountain that they crashed into is 1,500 feet high, and as I mentioned before, they crashed at 1,100 feet high. They cut down quite a few trees. They must have hit the mountain around 175, 200 miles an hour. They had no idea what happened. And the certain areas of Mount Beacon on that spot, I call it Scorched Earth, because grass has never grown there since that time. You still find pieces of the plane. From what I read, they actually buried the majority, if not all the pieces, what was left of it, in the mountainside there. So there was no way for them to bring everything down because everything was broken up into pieces. Next. As I mentioned before, Dixie Keefer was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And he actually is in a section on a hill. It's a tough hill for me to climb up. And the Pentagon's behind me. So when you look behind Dixie Keefer's headstone, you'll see the Pentagon. And if you notice in the photograph on the left of Dixie Keefer, his right hand has a cast on it. That's when he sustained that injury on the Ticonderoga incident, which took place January 21st, 1945. I'll tell you more about that later. Next. As mentioned before, Lloyd Heinsohn's also buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Coincidentally, he's not far from Dixie Keefer. All veterans can get these headstones free of charge or foot marker. I guess Heinsohn's family felt it was necessary. They were okay with the fact he was buried interred at Arlington National Cemetery. And Lloyd Denton is probably interred maybe one small block down away from Heidson. And Wood's probably at the other end of the cemetery. For whatever reason, I don't know. Possibly that Wood's family, not Wood, Hart, Clinton Hart, Clinton, like I mentioned, his wife was married. Maybe his wife just preferred him to be back in the other area. Next. I stopped by in Salem, Massachusetts cemetery, and I found the Zaleski plot. It's a family plot. You would not know, number one, he was a doctor. Number two, that he served in both World Wars, because all the family member names are on this. I talked to the local Veterans Association. I said maybe, or for that matter, the Polish Association. Zaleski was Polish. He was born here. His parents were born overseas before they immigrated to the United States, just to pay respect to the fact he served in 2 world wars, or both for that matter. Next. Hans Kohler is buried in the cemetery in Garfield, New Jersey. His footmarker is to your left, his parents is to the right, and his brother is in the back. His brother Rudolph, after serving in World War II, also in the Army. He was injured, got a Purple Heart. He fought in the European theater. Next. And we actually got there that day to see the footmarker. The entire thing was covered with grass and weeds and leaves. So I happened to have a pair of scissors in the car and cleaned it up. Should be more respect for this. Like I mentioned to you before, he was in line to get medals, and he forgot there was 4 different air medals. Next. Same trip from when I went to Salem, Massachusetts. I was on my way back from New Hampshire. I stopped off in Connecticut, where David Wood is interred again. Some of these cemeteries, just do the best I can, I gather. Norwich, Connecticut cemetery is where David Wood is. He was just, like I said, 23, only been in the service for about a year. Next. And it's an interesting story about Clarence Cooper's headstone. Obviously, you're looking at the headstone that's pretty much brand new, because it is. Because I've been to the sites of 7 of the 8 men that were killed between the 2 plane crashes. And I had no plans to go to Greensboro in the near future, so I called up the cemetery, once I was able to track it down. I explained my situation. I asked them, would they mind taking a photograph of Clarence Cooper's headstone? So they said, no problem. They would get back to me several days later. They called me back, said, sorry, but he's buried in an unmarked grave. So I worked with the VA because I've done enough of these presentations where I did mention this story in the past, because I didn't have a photograph to share with people in the audience. And a couple of people had mentioned to me, work with the VA about it, be able to get it. But between getting involved with the Mount Beacon 6 in June of 2015, and at this point, when I was able to get the headstone done, which was done by May of 2020, a very interesting thing happened along the way. Next. When we did the hike in 2020, we had some media attention, and apparently the media had a wide coverage. I don't know how, I guess the internet or whatever. So I received an email from a lady. I think Clarence Cooper is my father. Clarence was the only one out of the 8 that had children. He had a son out of wedlock, and he had his daughter about a year later. And at the time of his death, she was only 13 months old. So when she told me her name, I realized it was actually her. So we communicated, whether by phone, by emails. So I had invited her up to the anniversary, double anniversary in 2020, which would have been the 85th anniversary of the 35 plane crash and the 75th of the 45 plane crash. So I bought her a ticket to come up, because at that time, the former supervisor of the town of Fishkill, Bob Kohler, has said to me, Dave, not everybody's going to be able to hike up 1,100 and 1,500 feet of Mount Beacon to see the historic markers. We have a nice Veterans Park here, Route 52. Maybe you can get a plaque and put it on the wall, honoring all 8 men in that spot. So that was the ceremony is going to be about, to dedicate that plaque. And Clarence Hooper's daughter, Patricia Hooper Wiggins, was going to come. Unfortunately, the Monday before the ceremony, former Governor Cuomo enacted the new quarantine guidelines, and Patricia Hooper Wiggins canceled the plans. And so there was some other time down the road. It turned out to be a wonderful ceremony. County Executive Marinaro and Congressman Sean Maloney did incredible presentations themselves. I mean, we were there that day for a joint effort. One was to name streets after 2 former Fishkill residents that were killed during the Vietnam War, and then to honor the Mount Beacon 8. Now, they told me we had a few minutes to talk about it, and normally I work without notes, but I kind of was annoyed myself because I didn't think I got enough out, but it just covered enough information. But I was blown away about the county executive and the congressman, how they picked up where I left off. Obviously, they did their homework. So the point got across. It was a good presentation. Next. Now, during the time of all my research and these presentations that I was involved in, a lot of people had encouraged me to write a book about Dixie Kiefer and the plane crashes. I wasn't comfortable writing the book myself. I just felt like it needed to have the touch of a professional writer. I mean, I know I could have wrote the book, but I just wanted somebody that specialized in that area. So I came across a writer in several books I came across, and in his author's notes, several things he had mentioned, but the one that stood out. So if you have an idea about a topic that's never been written about before, contact me and we can maybe talk about a project together. So I said, here's my fate, here's my opportunity. So I sent an email to him with generalities about the plane crash in Dixie Kiefer, and lo and behold, the very next morning, he wrote back to me and said, I like what I hear, but you're going to have to trust me with the additional information. I'm a very busy person. I have a lot of projects that I've done and I'm in the middle of, but I really like what I hear. So I sent him all the other information. He wrote back to me again the next day. I said, let's do this project. This is really fascinating, and it's a story that should be told. So part of my research was to reach out anywhere, historical societies, libraries, newspapers, the internet, of course, was incredibly helpful. But I also reached out to the USS Ticonderoga Veterans Association. Dixie Kiefer had been the first commanding officer of the Ticonderoga. He took over as a commander in May of 1944. They were touched by the fact that I was going to write a book about Dixie Kiefer. And by the way, the name Ticonderoga was used, I think, 5 times altogether. The aircraft carrier was the 4th time. There was another ship after that, I think it was called the number 47, Ticonderoga. So it was just concentrate now on the aircraft carrier. So they asked me to come down to Tampa that year to speak at their annual reunion to talk about Dixie. And then the following year in New Orleans, and then they named me a lifetime member. They said, come down anytime I want, talk about it, sell the book. Because at that point, when Don Keefe's my co-author, I gave him all of my information. That January of 2017, he sent me back the first 5 chapters in March, 5 weeks later. And I did some edits, but we had the book published by 2017. We couldn't get publisher to take on the book, including Don's own agent, literary agent. So a couple of years ago, a publisher reached out to me and said, we'd like to take over the publishing of the book. So we went from soft cover to hardcover. So fast forward to this photograph. This is the reunion from this year, which took place in Norfolk, Virginia. I wanted to go down there for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to go to the reunion. Two, Norfolk, Virginia is the largest naval base in the country. San Diego is the second one. And I see San Diego every 6 months when I go out there to see my grandchildren. So I just thought it would be nice to see this base as well. Because also, most of the aircraft carriers were built in the Norfolk, Virginia area called Newport News, which is right across the river from Norfolk. So I had reached out to Clarence Hooper's daughter, who lived in that area, and I said, look, I'm coming down to the reunion, so maybe we could meet at the reunion. That was the photograph prior to this one, and you saw her holding my hardcover book. So I'm sitting here at the table, and the gentleman in front of the flag, he's the historian from the Ticonderoga Veteran Association. He's the one that helped me out a lot. And he told me to sit down to the guy, I have my back to you, and talk to this guy. He's a retired commanding officer for the Navy. But his father was the chief engineer on the Ticonderoga in January of 1945. He served under Dixie Keefer, but he actually became the commanding officer for 1 week for the Ticonderoga after the attack. It was a dual attack, kamikaze attack. 2 kamikazes hit the flight deck of the Ticonderoga in less than an hour. I'll get you more information about that later. Next. Now, while I was in Norfolk on the waterfront there, see this magnificent ship, and it turns out it's the USS New York, which the hull, sections of the hull, the keel, are melted steel from the World Trade Center. So this is their motto: strength forged through sacrifice, never forget. Next. Now, this is some of the plane remains from 1945. Turns out this is the bracket that held the engines. There were 2 engines on each, one on each wing. They're about 200 feet apart, so it made sense. I got confirmation from a couple of aviation experts what this was. Next. That's another section opposite the section I just showed you. It's the far end of this photograph. This is, if you want to say, the south end of the ridge of that debris field. Next. That's the area I referred to as Scorched Earth. Everything else in that area grew back, except for whatever reason, this particular spot. And you see the shredded pieces of metal on your left. Every now and then, pieces seem to appear. To me, this is sacred ground in this area. So when we see stuff come up, we pile it near the historic markers, and maybe someday we'll get a box if it keeps appearing. So people respect the area. Next. Now, I had mentioned to you before, when I saw the pieces of the plane from 1935, and several days later, I was doing a PowerPoint presentation at the Allen Center for the Beacon Historical Society. And one of the Bell family members came in, and he showed me the propeller from the 1945 plane. So it was an amazing couple of days for me, to say the least. You know, to read about these gentlemen, all these 8 guys in the different newspaper accounts, with the help of Senator Gillibrand's office, I was able to get the personal records of all 8 men. So I knew how tall they were, how much they weighed, the color of their eyes, everything else. So now to touch the pieces of plane that they were on. It was kind of a, a fitting moment. Next. That's the trail to get to the 45 crash. To get to that trailway, you have to go to the Glenham section of Fishkill up in the parking lot, which they call Fishkill Ridge. You see off to the left is the Hudson River. It's a very steep trail. It's probably, like I said, 1,000 feet up in the parking lot. So the different hikes that I had, we tell people just, it's not a race, just take your time. Next. That's how we used to have the flags across the trailway that I had just showed you near the crash site. It's like a switchback. You come up that long trail, cut back to the left and to the right, and here's where the flags are, about 500 feet off that second cutback. Again, United States, New York State, and the Navy. So we brought the flags over closer to the crash site. Next. You see more of the pieces of the plane there. Somebody had put down 6 flags in honor of the 6 men from the 45 crash site. On the tree is a piece of plywood with the article of the New York Times from Monday, November 12th, and it's laminated with a piece of plastic to protect it from the elements. When I first found out about a plane crash in Mount Beacon, it was after we had the ceremony to dedicate the dedication of the Mount Beacon Fire Tower project, which was June of 2013. So somebody came over to me and asked me if I knew anything about a plane crash on Mount Beacon, and I said I had no idea. I'm not really from the area. I said, do you know anything about it? They said no. So that's when I went to the internet, found out about the 1945 crash, and found out a Navy legend was killed at Mount Beacon. I just really got my interest going. So I knew somebody in the area from that section. If he knew about where that plane crash site was, sure. So he brought me up there. So this is the day it came up there. So it had to be, I sat on the concept for a while. So it was the following year. So it's October 2014 when I stood there for the first time. And after reading the article, the New York Times article, and looking around, I said, more people should know about this. And that's how I started off on the story. Next. And that's the actual article. It's too small to read it, but you can actually get it online. Again, there's Dixie Kiefer on the right with his arm in a cast from the injuries he sustained from the dual kamikaze attack, January 21st, 1945, out in the China Sea. And you see his cap down the bottom of the photograph to the left. Next. Now that's a perspective from the debris field, looking due west towards Newburgh. You see the Hudson River there. So you can see all the trees that are still down from the time the plane crashed and other trees that grew up. But you can look to the left, you see that mountain ridge there. It's amazing how they passed that, and because the crash could have been at that site, which should have been closer to Route 9. Next. That's when we took that hike in June of 2015 that I had mentioned. Actually, about 55 people showed up that day, including media types, print and electronic. And the gentleman that's in the middle of the crowd with a blue shirt, who's reading the sign, he's actually one of your own in the Beacon area. That's George Atkinson. George hiked up that day at the time, being in 2015, I think he was 88 years old. I walked with him the whole time up, and I just found it amazing. A guy 88 years old wanted to take this hike. And I asked him why. He said, I haven't been up here since the day of the plane crash, or actually the day after. But his brother was quoted in the article. The New York Times article, reporters went around to big and Fishkill residents to interview them about what they knew about the plane crash. Next. Now, a year later, I received an email from this gentleman, Ted Davis, and he said to me, I had Dixie Keefer's medal, and I'd like to give it to you because I was on my way to go down to South Carolina to bring it to the Aircraft Carrier Museum, the USS Yorktown, CB-10. C is in Charlie, B is in Victor 10. And I think it belongs to you and your organization because what have you done for the memory of Dixie Keefer? So we agreed to meet, and we go up to the crash site, and at that point, that's when he would make the exchange. Next. So these are all the medals he received, which includes some personal items from when he graduated from Annapolis. You can see at the top near the cap, that's his graduation ring. Tie clips, cufflinks, and to the top left of the medals, that's the Navy Cross. It's the highest award you can receive when you're in the Navy. No higher award than that is the Congressional Medal of Honor. And there were several times Dixie Keefer could have been considered for it, but Dixie Keefer wasn't your typical naval officer. He would just get down and with the guys, and he would. He said it was quoted several times to say that I wouldn't put these men in positions of things I wouldn't do. And then when the pilots would come back from the combat missions, I mean, it took really a lot of guts for people to fly in combat missions. They would bring them in and debrief them and have alcohol shots, I guess, Dixie's cocktail hour, what they would call it, to get these guys to relax. So he was well loved by his men. Matter of fact, I met 5 or 6 men that served underneath Dixie on the Yorktown, which is in 1942. That was the CB-5 Yorktown, and then the Ticonderoga in 45. And they all adored that guy. He called all the men that served underneath him Dixie's kids. He was not married. He would drag his mom around, his sister around to all the different bases wherever he served. Next. I put this together to give you an idea what it looked like. He's got one Purple Heart on the top right, but you don't get a second Purple Heart medal. You'll get additional ones in lieu of the first one. So I don't have the breakdown in front of me right now. I think it's important at this point, but there were several very important medals there as well. Next. It goes back to the ceremony that we were at the town of Fishkill, Bob McCullen, November 2015, just to bring recognition and highlight what happened both in 2015 and not 2015, 1945 and 1935. Next. As part of the ceremony, I reached out to Senator Joe Byrne's office and I asked her if it's possible maybe you can get somebody from the Navy to attend. And actually, you got a gentleman to the right in the brown coat and the cap, Navy retired commanding officer. And then the gentleman with the naval uniform was actually a commanding officer from New York City who handled the Fleet Week and the public relations for the Navy in the metropolitan area. Next. So now we'll talk a little bit more directly about Dixie Keefer. As I mentioned, he was born in Lockwood, Idaho in, let's just say it there, but I believe it's like 1896. Family moved when he was 6 years old to Lincoln, Nebraska, where he finished high school. From there, he enrolled in Annapolis. Next. My daughter lived in northern Utah for a couple of years because my son-in-law was in the Air Force. Blackfoot was only about 150 miles away. I figured I'd drive up there and see what it looked like. It turns out it's the potato capital of the world. Next. Now, I found out in the middle of Blackfoot, which is actually the county seat for that area. It's called Bingham County. They had a former ball field there. They turned into a Patriots Park. I just assumed incorrectly that there would be some listing of Dixie Kiefer in there. Next. So I didn't find anything there. So I went to the local librarian, talked to her about Dixie Kiefer. She had no idea about him. She really thanked me for bringing this information to her attention. She asked me for my information, and then the next thing you know, about a week or two later, I get a phone call from the county clerk who wanted to know even more information, and said this time next year, Dixie Kiefer would be up on that plaque on that wall. And there you go. They just didn't know they had this Navy legend born in this town, but it's understandable. His family left when he was 6 years old. Next. That's Lincoln High School, where Dixie went to high school. He was on the football team there. That's where he hurt his knee, which kind of stayed with him over the years. Next. That's his childhood home in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is still there today. And his name is on this plaque of the Lincoln, Nebraska relatives. It's hard for me to see right now, but that was good that they honored him there as well. And I actually got the photograph from somebody from the high school who did research for me. And that was the thing I came across during this whole process, is how enthusiastic a lot of people were that when I reached out for help, and they would go far beyond my requests. And I asked one of them one time, how come? He says, well, our jobs are boring. This is exciting stuff. It's new. We'd love to get involved in stuff like this. They were helpful, very, very helpful. Next. At Annapolis in Maryland, Dixie Kiefer went there from 1915 to 1918. After he went to World War I and finished his assignment, he came back, he got his master's, and then he went down to Pensacola, Florida, to learn how to become a pilot. Next. So I can mention he graduated in 1918 in accelerated class. Next. That was the first ship he was on when he was over in Europe, the USS St. Louis. I think he ended up being on 15 or 16 ships. And coincidentally, he was on the USS Wright, which was named after the Wright brothers. And that's the coincidence being that he was involved with the Curtiss-Wright aviation companies. The USS Wright was on its way back from Midway to Pearl Harbor when the Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941. So once he got back to base, they took him off the Wright and they put him on the aircraft carrier, the USS Yorktown CB-5. Next. I'll get back to about the Yorktown later, but this after, Dixie's not in this photograph, but I just came across it. Once he got his wings, he eventually became a flight instructor, and in Pensacola, Florida. From there, they shipped him out to San Diego Naval Base, where he also was a flyer. And I think on November 11th, 1924, he was the first person to ever fly a plane off a ship at night. And this is the type of planes, the seaplanes that they used at the time, because the aircraft carriers at that time were in its infant stages. They took two ships. It was the Langley and the Saratoga, former freight ships, and they modified it with like flight decks. So it was all infancy. What Dixie Keeper did was most of those planes at the time were catapulted off of ships. So he was on the USS California in San Diego Bay, and with the aid of spotlights, they fired him off the plane. And the remarkable thing, the talent that you needed with these seaplanes was that in order to get back onto the ships, you had to go behind the stern, which is the fantail, the rear of the ship, and come as quickly as you possibly can with the speed of the plane as you're floating up to the platform that's being dragged behind, the floating platform. Land down there and shut your engines off before you hit the back of the ship. And then a crane that was up on the boat would pick up the plane, put it back in its position to get reloaded for another flight. So there's a lot of skill involved there. Next. As I mentioned before, he was an aeronautical engineer inspector. He had a degree in Annapolis. He also had the master's in Annapolis, and then they sent him up to MIT to get another master's. So, smart man, to say the least. And think about it, to be in charge of 3,500 people, to get his first post as a commanding officer of the USS Ticonderoga later on. Says a lot about that. Next. Now, executive officer is second in command. This is the Yorktown CB-5. I mentioned before about the Yorktown CB-10, which is an aircraft museum down in South Carolina in Charleston Bay, right directly across from the city of Charleston. There's a park called Patriots Park. That town is called Mount Pleasant, and it's a beautiful waterfront. You got the aircraft carrier, you have a destroyer there as well. And as you enter that park, there's a submarine memorial, which is, I didn't know that South Carolina was the second leading manufacturer of aircraft carriers, submarines. New London, Connecticut is the submarine capital of the world. Next. Now, shortly after Dixie Kiefer was assigned to the Yorktown CB-5, they got involved in the Battle of Coral Sea, which took on a lot of damage from the Japanese planes attacks. They were able to save the ship and then to get it back to Pearl Harbor. Considering the damage of the ship, they figured it'd be laid up for 6-8 months. Navy Nimitz had other ideas, as you'll see. Next. Now, they had the Navy, the intelligence came up with the fact that they believed the Japanese were going to have another all-out assault sometime in June, and they were right on the money, because now you have the Battle of Midway. It's early in the war. It's only June of 1942, but believe it or not, many historians consider this the turning point of the war. CB-5 took a lot of damage that day, and they actually abandoned ship, figuring that it would sink by the end of the day. So when they woke up the next day, a lot of the people were able to get off, the sailors and officers were able to get off to nearby ships. This was a big battle, so there were other aircraft carriers in the way, the Hornet, the Saratoga. So they woke up the next day, the ship was still afloat. So the captain of the Yorktown assigned Dixie and 100 men to go back over to see what they could do to bury, see the men that were killed, get their dog tags, and whatever they could do, maybe possibly save the Yorktown. But unfortunately, Japanese submarines snuck in between the perimeter of defense and sank one of the ships that was directly next to the Yorktown, and then the Yorktown got hit with several torpedoes. Next. And that's the last of the Yorktown CV-5 that's headed to the bottom of the sea on June 7th, 1942. Dixie Keeper was the last person to ever jump off the Yorktown. During that process, they were lowering a basket of one of the guys that was injured, and Dixie was actually lowering himself, but the rope slipped and burned his hands, and the guy went crashing down and was stuck on the side of the ship and the ocean. So Dixie then tried to lower himself down, and he had a bit of a weight problem. And let's face it, he was an officer who really wasn't much into training and working out anymore. So because of the injuries to his hands, he couldn't hold his own weight anymore. He fell down, hit the side of the aircraft carrier with the armament belt, shattered his leg and his ankle, fell into the ocean. Despite this, he swam over to the injured sailor in the basket, grabbed him, and dragged him over to one of the waiting life rafts. And by then, he basically passed out, so they grabbed him before he drowned and brought him on board to one of the nearby waiting ships. Amazing to have a broken leg, shattered ankle, and his hands burned to a crisp. And still think about other people first. Next. Now, while he was recovering, the Navy was going to make a documentary that they, I guess, was showing in the movie theaters. And this particular one is called The Fighting Lady. They had Dixie in the movie as one of the captains. You had a captain for the first part, and Dixie was the captain for the second part. And he was known as Captain Dixie. As you see, the documentary got Best Academy Award in 1945. Now, the Fighting Lady ship they used, the aircraft carrier, eventually became the Yorktown CV-10. So the Dixie Keeper ended up being on 5 of the first 14 aircraft carriers in existence. Next. Now it's the Yorktown down in South Carolina. I'm standing in Charleston, looking across the bay. To my right is Fort Sumter, which is the beginning of the Civil War. That's Mount Pleasant. Beautiful, beautiful area. On the ocean front of Mount Pleasant is Sullivan Islands. What a beautiful location. Throughout the ship is nicknamed the Fighting Lady. You see that name posted all over the place. So they took a lot of pride in the fact it was used for that movie. Next. All right. After he recovered from his injuries, bounced around doing different things on land at the aviation industry locations. They named him the first commanding officer of the USS Ticonderoga, which had the CV-14 identification. In the beginning, all aircraft carriers were named after famous battles during the Revolutionary War. And speaking of that, I told you before, he was given the title Commodore just prior to his death, because not just him, but several other captains were entitled to promotions and pay raises. And there was no need for any more admirals. If he had lived another couple of years, he probably would have been an admiral during the Korean War. So this is, I just wanted to point that out. He probably would have got that title back to captain in a period of time, but it's just that I'm not sure if he's one of the few that still retained that title of Commodore. And Commodore was named that hadn't been used since the War of 1812. Next. That's the when he assumed command, the big ceremony, May 8th, 1944, in Newport News, Virginia, which is right across the harbor from Norfolk, Virginia. Next. A couple of weeks ago, when I was in San Diego visiting my grandkids, somebody had told me while I was at the Norfolk, Virginia reunion that you'll be able to see the ship's bell for the Ticonderoga. In San Diego, there's an island right off the shoreline called Coronado Island. Beautiful, beautiful area. I mean, downtown San Diego nowadays is just absolutely gorgeous. And Coronado Island is just spectacular. But in that area, there are 5 naval bases. And one in this particular spot is called North Island, where all the aircraft carrier ships would dock. Because there's a big bridge connecting Coronado Island to San Diego, where the rest of the naval bases are. And you're not going to have the aircraft carriers get stuck down there in case we're attacked again. So this is, I couldn't get on the property because of security, but I was able to reach somebody in the public relations department for public affairs, better way of saying it, for the Navy, and asked them, would you mind taking a photo for the bell for me? Personally, I think that bell belongs upstate in Fort Ticonderoga because Fort Ticonderoga has a small section of their fort museum that's dedicated to the ships that were named after the aircraft, after the name Ticonderoga. There's a big plaque in that room dedicated to Dixie Keefer. As a matter of fact, the captain's chair is in that room. I did talk to the Historical Society in Ticonderoga and the fort itself, and I reached out to people in the Navy. I mean, it's not an easy process, to tell you the truth. Sometimes when things are supposed to be done the right way, it just doesn't happen. But maybe it'll happen someday if you get the right people involved. But it definitely belongs up there. There's a bell, the Arinsky aircraft carrier, upstate New York. The bell sits there in the middle of a public park, and a whole bunch of important information. And the same thing should be for the USS Ticonderoga. It doesn't belong to San Diego. It belongs to New York State for Ticonderoga. Next. Now, after the ship was built, they have what they call sea trials, and they come back and they may change crews or officers. They change all the time. And it's just, now they make their way down through the Atlantic Ocean. They go through the Panama Canal up the Pacific coast, go to San Diego. They pick up all this equipment and they bring it out to Pearl Harbor. Next. There's Dixie at the so-called bridge. The bridge is it's outside the powerhouse. The powerhouse is fortified, so if the ship is under attack, you have a better chance of survival if you stay there. But Dixie loved to be on the bridge to watch always man and all the activity. Different. We got a ship of 3,500 people. There's all different departments, and people that would handle the airplanes coming and going would be in a different part of the ship. And I didn't notice until recently that, for the sake of in case the ship is under attack, controls of the ship, which are in the pilot house, there's a second set on another section of the plane. So if those areas are damaged, the plane could be controlled by the backup, which I found amazing and brilliant, to be honest with you. Next. Now, January 21st, 1945, the Ticonderoga was hit by 2 kamikaze planes in the span of 1 hour. The first one hit the flight deck, caused considerable damage. The second one was at the foot of the what they call the con tower. That's the big tower object to your right of your photograph. That's where, I guess, the heart of the aircraft carriers. They know that's where the leaders are, the communications. So if they can hit that, they'll put that ship out of commission. Next. So that's when the damage sustained from that second plane. And you can see the gentleman standing there, excuse me, on that second level. That's the bridge area. The powerhouse would be to his left. Dixie was out there to your left where the staircase is when the second plane hit. How he stayed alive is amazing. But he probably annoyed a lot of the commanding officers and the higher ups that, this is like one of his ways when he wanted to do things his way, which probably been one of the reasons why he didn't get the Congressional Medal of Honor. Next. The entire process caused considerable damage. 143 men were killed, 202 men injured, including Dixie Kiefer. I didn't know this until just past week. This whole research process is always ongoing, but I didn't know there was like 70 men missing in action. Now, that's understandable because people get blown right off the flight decks. People just get obliterated, vaporized, whatever the word is. I could tell you that from not my personal experience, but from a personal story from my father. When he was on this ship in the South Pacific, he was actually on a small ship called LCS. It was number 88. And they were in the Battle of Okinawa, May 11th, 1945. And the kamikaze plane was headed towards his ship. And one of the gunners on his ship blew his wing off because he was aiming for the communications tower or con tower, which my father was in because my father was a radio man. He was 19 years old at the time. But because the plane wing got blown off, the plane veered to the right to the fan channel section of the plane. And incredibly, the pilot was able to release the bomb at the back of my father's ship. And then the other wing hit the ship as well. And the bomb went off, killing 25 people and a crew of 71, including commanding officer. But later on, during the cleanup operation, they came across a lake just by itself. So they realized it was one of the friends that they knew, and they chucked it into the ocean since there was nothing else around. And the sad thing is there's no choice in the matter, but when you don't have a body, the military lists the soldier, sailor, marine as MIA, which got a lot of focus, rightly so, during the Vietnam War, but they didn't have that same attention back in World War II. So my father and his friend that were on the ship went back to Brooklyn, where this guy grew up, and went to the family's house to tell the sister to warn the mom that he's never coming back. But I'll get into further details because families have hope if it's missing in action that maybe their loved one will return. But they thought they were doing the right thing, which I think they did. Next. Now, before I went to my first Ticonderoga Veterans Association reunion in 2017, I thought I should get myself onto the Intrepid Aircraft Carrier because I had never been on one before, and just walk around and get the feel of it, and especially go up to the bridge and to the powerhouse just to see maybe at the captain's quarters, just to get a feel of what it's like. The hangar deck is the second one down where the planes come up when they're getting ready to take off. It just felt like it was necessary to do that. Next. So there's the bridge I mentioned several times, and that's the door to the pilot's house. Just so you know, there were 5 aircraft carrier museums in the United States. So you have one here in New York, the Intrepid. You have one in South Carolina, which is Yorktown, CV-10. You have one in Texas, Corpus Christi, Texas, the Lexington. The Midway is in San Diego, and the Hornet is in Oakland, California, directly across from San Francisco. Next. Do me a favor, just back up one photo, please. Regarding Dixie being on the Ticonderoga in that area of the bridge, at the time of the massive explosion of the second plane attack, I read a report of one of the sailors who was on the flight deck with Dixie, and as he was trying to get away, Dixie jumped on top of him to cover him when the explosion took. Because when Dixie got hit, the sailor unscathed. Dixie got 65 pieces of shrapnel throughout his body and a shattered right arm. And I'll get into a little bit after this. We'll get back to it. Because what Dixie Kiefer did after that was utterly remarkable. He stayed on that bridge. He could barely stand up, obviously, because of the injuries. But he stayed there until the attack stopped. The fires were put out on the hangar deck and on the flight deck, and all injured men were taken care of before he agreed to get medical care, which was 11 hours later. Next. Now, that's when they're going to take him off the Ticonderoga. He's going to give a speech. I actually heard a recording of this speech. You can see all these men around him. I actually saw a photograph of the wide angle of how many men were standing around Dixie Kiefer. They adored him. As a matter of fact, one guy I spoke to said he was a sailor at the time, that Dixie, he was standing on shower line, as they say, to get food. So Dixie came up to him and said, "Can I buy you an ice cream?" So the guy's now 90-something years old, and he still talks about it like he's a young kid. It's like this legend wants to buy me an ice cream. So it's pretty cool. Next. There's Dixie being lowered over the side. Look at the gentleman in respect with saluting him. Now, the thing is, the gentleman in the bottom right is the father of the man that I met for the reunion in Norfolk last month. So it was just pretty wild when he saw his father, his photograph in this book. I gave him a copy of the book to thank him for his service. He had served in the Navy for 30 years himself. He was also a graduate of Annapolis, and for what his father did with Dixie during the situation on the Ticonderoga. Next. Now he's not really Beacon's own, he's Madawan's own, but Beacon became the city in 1913. So we still give it to him. His house is on Route 52. Most people have no idea when they drive by his house. There's actually a plaque on a pole Bob told me about, Bob Murphy, from the Beacon Historical Society. It's Plank and 52 near the old high schools, 2 homes in. There's a little green plaque that says who lived here and the history behind the Forrestal family. Father had a lot to do. I guess he was in the construction business, built a lot of homes in that area. And he's the guy that gave Dixie Kiefer the indestructible man name. Next. After he recovered from his injuries, I guess another officer that was also hurt on the ship. They were just, going different assignments or different award ceremonies. Next. Here's Dixie when he was up in New England after he took over the commanding officer at Ponce Point, Rhode Island, Naval Air Station. It was actually the entire northeast there of New England. He was heading that area as well. It was a hell of a responsibility. But as you see, he wasn't a tall man at all, a little bit on the chubby side. It was always marked in his personnel records how they always told him that he needs to lose weight. And then also you see on his right hand the cast. Next. So it goes back to the first reunion I attended back in Tampa in 2017. These are 4 guys that were there that served under the Dixie and the Ticonderoga. They've all 4 since that time passed away. The second guy to the left with the blue shirt on and the cap off, he actually came down from Alaska for this reunion. He would never miss a reunion. There was one other guy that couldn't make it there, but he insisted that somebody drive me out to his house about 40 miles away, who was the guy that actually started the Veterans Association. But obviously he was getting up in age, and he also was becoming ill. Next. They brought me out to Walter Mallett's house. He was on fire control, and from what I understand, sustained serious burn injuries when they was trying to put the fires out on the flight deck on the Ticonderoga on January 21st, 1945. He had his family lay out all these awards and medals that he received, certificates on his dining room table. I read through them, and again, when I talked to him about Dixie Kiefer, tears would come streaming down his cheeks. And, just struck a raw nerve. He really admired and loved Dixie Kiefer. Sadly, Walter died a week later. Fortunate I got a chance to meet him. Next. Now, this is one that I really annoyed with myself. Going back to the Mount Beacon Fire Tower days, I would always try and seek publicity for the projects. And somehow I got a contact with the Associated Press office in Albany. So I reached out to him to tell him about the Mount Beacon 8 stuff. So my contact said, I no longer work here, but I copied the guy that's going to take over my position, and he'll get in touch with you. So about several hours later, I get an email back from this gentleman, and he says, my name is George Walsh, Jr. I'm now in charge of this AP, and anything you have about Dixie Kiefer, you send my way, because my father was a fighter pilot for Dixie Kiefer on the Ticonderoga. Now, what I got mad about myself was he was alive and well up until last year, 2 years ago, and he actually invited me to touch base with him. I talked to him on the phone. You could actually find interviews on YouTube. He was an incredible fighter pilot. And he had a hell of a career in advertising after he got back to the United States when the war was over. But he invited me to come up to his independent living facility in Connecticut and have a brunch. And I just forgot about it. And then when the movie Midway came out, and I saw what these guys went through as fighter pilots, incredible movie. I wanted to go online to see if I could see his interview. And that's why I discovered that his obituary that he had passed away. So I reached out to the son with my apologies and my regret of never taking his father up on his offer. Next. So the gentleman to my right, I'm sitting to the left, is Don Keefe, my co-author. Don's written over close to 40 books now, mostly about the military. submarines especially. In particular, one of his books was turned into a movie. The book was called Firing Point. For whatever reason, they changed it to Hunter Killer, starring Gary Oldman, Gerard Butler, and the former rapper Common. So this is when we met for the first time in New Orleans in May of 2018. Don lives in Alabama. The amazing thing is we never had a contract. It's just we didn't even have a handshake for that matter. So obviously once the publisher got involved, then we had to sign contracts. No way around that one. It was a pleasure to work with him. Like I said, we got to some of the other projects after the one I worked with him in this book. So nothing but success to Don. Next. We had a little table set up. Of course, there's one room for our book. But Don, it's just what Don does for a living, so he needs to promote these other books as well. Next. That was the plaque I mentioned to you earlier, that former town supervisor from Fishkill had suggested we put on that wall that they had, that beautiful memorial park. Problem was this little plaque, 16 by 24, cost more than those two historic markers combined. So we had to borrow the money and then raise the money and to pay the people back that lent us the money, because it takes time to order this plaque, and we wanted it ready for that November 2020 Veterans Day ceremony. Next. That was the first edition of our book, The Indestructible Man. Erin Press, Don owns that company. He was so annoyed that nobody would pick up the book, including his literary agent. They all said it was a good story. It is a fabulous story, I might say. But he said, we'll put it out. Now, whatever money I got, proceeds, the royalties, whatever you call it, I put it back in the fund and help pay for those signs and the plaque. For me, it wasn't about the money. It was just about to get the word about these 8 men that, as I say, forgotten by some, because let's face it, 80 plus years and 70 years ago, and unknown to most. Next. And it's the new book, Stackpole Books, Roman Littlefield's imprints called Stackpole Books. It would have been out for the 2020 anniversary, except the COVID situation hit and backed it up to spring of 2021. So it's been out for about a year now. So I promote as much as I can. Publishers in these days just publish as many books as they can. We're not big name authors, so they just do what they have to do and then move on to their other projects. So wherever I can do presentations, I've still done one, and as you know, I did one for the big historical society several weeks ago. I did one out in San Diego in November, and I've been invited by Fort Ticonderoga and the Historical Society to come up on Veterans Day this year. And they guarantee me 50, 75 people minimum. So they will bring some of those books as well. Next. That's the end of the show, folks. Hope you learn more about what took place on Mount Beacon with the 2 Navy plane crashes. If you know organizations that want me to come up and do a presentation, I'd be more than happy to. Always thank a veteran when you see one. Teach the children about the history, or even the adults, about what took place in Mount Beacon on September 14th, 1935, and what took place on November 11th, 1945. These 8 men, lost their lives serving their country. Yes, it wasn't the glory of battles in war, but several of them were in battles in war. Dixie Keeper, Dr. Zaleski, Hans Kohler, Roy Heinsohn. They were all out there in the South Pacific or in the northern North Atlantic theater as well. So, it's just teach the young children especially. They need to know about this history because a lot of history lately has been um, forgotten about or not even touched upon. So thank you for your time, and to check up on the internet on the different stories that were put out, especially a great New York Times article, July 25th, 2017, called Lost in the Woods. There's a lot of other stories that were put out as well. There's a great interview by RNN, which used to be partners with Verizon Files. It was a great interview at that time. And if you're interested, you can reach out. My email address is Coyote Rock, COYOTEOC @Verizon.net. If you look on the internet, I'm sure you're going to find us somewhere there. Again, I thank you for your time, and I thank Peter for his time as well, and the opportunity from the Beacon Historical Society. Have a good day.